She wasn't the kind of woman men noticed when she walked into a room. Not because she was invisible, she wasn't. Juniper Hale was 5'4", with dark auburn hair that curled just past her shoulders, and a face that, if you actually bothered to look, had the kind of bone structure that painters used to call classical. But she was soft where the world told women to be sharp. She was round where magazines said to be narrow. She wore sensible flats and cardigans in muted colors, and she had a habit of positioning herself just slightly behind whoever she was standing next to, as if she could redistribute her own presence the way she redistributed budget line items, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to the adjustment. She was the best forensic accountant the Sever Group had ever hired. She had also spent 3 years making sure nobody in the organization fully understood what that meant. It was safer that way. The Sever Group operated out of a glass tower on the east side of the financial district, and to the IRS, to the city's zoning board, to the 3 separate charity foundations it funded every year, it was a perfectly legitimate private equity firm. To the 12 families who ran the Eastern Seaboard's underground economy, it was something else entirely. It was the machine that moved the money. It was the place where blood became balance sheets. And Juniper Hale balanced the sheets. She had known what she was walking into when she took the job. She hadn't been naive about it. She'd grown up in South Baltimore in a neighborhood where everyone knew someone who knew someone, where you learned early that the line between legal and illegal was mostly a matter of who was keeping the records. She was good at keeping records. She was exceptional at it. And when the offer came through a contact at her second accounting firm, a firm that dissolved, mysteriously 6 months after she left it, she had done the math and taken the job, was named Caspian Vore. She had seen him exactly 4 times in 3 years, which was more than most people who worked for him could claim. He moved through the organization the way a cold front moves through a city. You felt the drop in temperature before you saw anything. Doors opened ahead of him. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the senior partners, men who had survived federal investigations and rival family power plays, and one very memorable incident involving a Brinks truck and the Baltimore Harbor, went slightly still when Caspian Vore walked into a room. He was 41. He was 6'2" with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of deep water. Not blue, not gray, something between the two that shifted depending on his mood, though his moods were rarely anything other than controlled. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome if it had ever learned to relax. It hadn't. There were photographs of him smiling at charity galas, and they all looked the same, like a man who had studied the mechanics of a smile without ever quite feeling the impulse. He was, by every measure Juniper had applied to the problem, genuinely dangerous. She had also, very quietly and very privately, and in a place she kept locked behind approximately 17 mental deadbolts, been a little in love with him for about 2 of the 3 years she'd worked at the Sever Group. She was not proud of this. She considered it roughly equivalent to developing feelings for a Category 4 hurricane. Technically understandable, given its dramatic qualities. Practically speaking, a very bad idea. She did not act on it. She filed her reports. She ran her numbers, she wore her cardigans. She made herself invisible, and she was good at it, and that was how things were. Until the Wednesday in October when everything changed, and the chain of events that set it off was something as ordinary and unremarkable as a birthday. Her friend Callie had turned 34 and had declared, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had survived a difficult year and intended to celebrate that survival loudly, that they were going to Duval's. Duval's was the kind of restaurant where the menu had no prices, and the sommelier made more than most attorneys, and the lighting was the specific shade of amber that made everyone look like they were in a French New Wave film. Juniper had protested mildly. Callie had ignored the protest entirely. So Juniper had done something she rarely did. She had gone home after work and taken out a dress. It was a deep burgundy, long-sleeved, with a neckline that was not quite demure and not quite daring, but existed in an interesting territory between the two. She'd bought it 2 years ago at a sample sale and worn it exactly once to her cousin's wedding, and had spent that entire evening slightly convinced she was taking up too much space. But Callie had said wear something nice, and this was the nicest thing she owned. So she put it on, and she did her makeup with slightly more intention than usual, and she looked at herself. In the mirror, for a long moment, she looked different, not unrecognizably different. But the woman in the mirror was not the woman in the cardigans. This woman had curves that the cardigans had spent 3 years quietly apologizing for, and this woman was not apologizing. She had a waist and hips that the muted colors and the sensible flats had been carefully calibrating downward for years. Juniper considered this for approximately 15 seconds. Then she put on her coat and went to meet Callie. She did not know that 3 tables away, behind a partition of frosted glass and a low arrangement of white orchids, Caspian Vor was having dinner with 4 men who collectively controlled enough pharmaceutical distribution routes to fund a small government. She did not know this because she had not seen him. She had been focused on the menu and on Callie's running commentary about the bread basket, and on the pleasant, uncomplicated business of having a life that existed outside of spreadsheets and double-entry accounting, and the very specific anxiety of knowing what she knew about where certain large amounts of money had been, and where they were going. Caspian saw her before she saw him. He saw her because his table had a sightline to the entrance, and because he noticed things. It was a survival skill that had calcified over 20 years into something close to instinct. He noticed faces. He noticed the way people moved through spaces, whether they were looking for someone or avoiding someone, whether their posture was confident or defensive. He catalogued information the way other people breathed. He saw a woman in a burgundy dress walk through the door of Duval's, and something in his chest did something he did not immediately have a name for. Then he recognized her. He sat very still for a moment, which the men at his table would have recognized, had they been paying attention, as a sign that something significant had happened. Caspian Vore, very still, was Caspian Vore processing something unexpected, and unexpected things were dangerous things. Juniper Hale, his forensic accountant, the woman who sent him quarterly reports that were so precise, so elegantly constructed, so free of even the possibility of error, that his head of legal had once described them as almost unsettlingly perfect. The woman he knew, professionally, entirely professionally, as a pair of initials on a report and a quiet presence in the background of department meetings. The woman who he was now being forced to acknowledge, he had apparently never actually looked at. He had looked at her. Obviously, he had looked at her. He had been in the same room as her dozens of times, but he had not, it turned out, seen her. The woman in the burgundy dress was laughing at something her companion had said, and her whole face changed when she laughed. Opened up, became unguarded, became something that made people at nearby tables look over without quite knowing why. She was leaning forward slightly, one elbow on the table, animated in a way she never was at work, and Caspian had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being introduced to a person he had been standing next to for 3 years. Vor. He looked back at the table. Alderman Briggs, who controlled the harbor allocation contracts, and who Caspian needed on his side for something that was going to happen in 60 days, and could not happen without the man's cooperation, was watching him with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that Caspian's attention had just gone somewhere else. The Eastport arrangement, Caspian said, without missing a beat, because he did not miss beats. He returned to the conversation. He was perfectly present. He said the right things in the right order with the right degree of measured authority, and he concluded the preliminary terms of an agreement that his legal team would formalize over the next 2 weeks. And underneath all of it, with the specific controlled compartmentalization of a man who had been running parallel operations since his early 20s, he was aware of exactly where Juniper Hale was sitting, and that she was now on her second glass of wine, and that she was wearing very small gold earrings that caught the light when she turned her head. This was, he recognized, a problem. He had a protocol for problems: identify, assess, resolve. He had been applying this protocol to everything from hostile takeover attempts to federal surveillance to a situation in Providence 2 years ago that had required both a lawyer and a boat. He applied it now. Identify. He was experiencing something in the vicinity of personal interest in an employee. Assess. This was professionally complicated, organizationally inadvisable, and, given who he was and what he did and what she knew about it, genuinely unkind to the employee in question. Resolve. Note it, set it aside, and under no circumstances do anything about it. This was a clean and logical resolution. He was satisfied with it. Juniper stood up to go to the restroom. She was walking past his partition. He did not stand up. He did not call her name. He sat exactly where he was, and she walked past without seeing him, and he watched her go with an expression that his head of security, who was seated 2 tables away and had been with Caspian for 11 years, had never seen on his face before and would spend some time afterward trying to categorize. She came back from the restroom. She saw him. The exact sequence of what happened in Juniper Hale's face during the 3 seconds that followed was something Caspian filed away with more precision than he filed most information. First, blankness, the split-second processing delay. Then, recognition, her eyes widening slightly. Then, something that might have been alarm, or might have been something else, and then, and this was the part he found himself returning to, something that locked down over went neutral and professional and calm, in the way that people went neutral and professional and calm when they had practice at it. She worked for him. Of course she had practice at it. She gave a small, composed nod, the nod of someone who has recognized an acquaintance in a public space and is prepared to handle the situation with a minimum of drama. He nodded back. She returned to her table. He watched her sit down, watched her lean toward her friend and say something low and quick, watched the friend look over, discreetly, but not that discreetly, and then apparently say something that made Juniper press her lips, clips together, in an expression that he would have called to make that assessment if he'd known her well enough to make that assessment. He thought he might want to know her well enough to make that assessment. He also thought, this is the problem, identified, assessed, and apparently not as resolved as I believed. He stood up. His head of security, whose name was Dicklin and who was paid extremely well to read situations quickly, stood up as well 2 tables away, hand moving reflexively toward his jacket before Caspian's almost imperceptible headshake stopped him. Caspian walked to Juniper's table. She looked up at him. Her expression was remarkably composed. He noted, with something that felt entirely inappropriate to what was supposed to be a professional encounter, that the burgundy of the dress was almost exactly the same shade as the wine in her glass. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Mr. Vore," she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, steady, clear, with that slight mid-Atlantic quality that told him she'd grown up working class somewhere and had spent years not quite erasing it. He had always found it when he thought about it, which was not often, which was to say more often than he'd admitted to himself, oddly grounding. "I didn't know you frequented Duval's." "Occasionally," he said. "The private dining is useful, of course." Her friend was watching this exchange with the very particular expression of someone whose curiosity is fighting their attempt to appear as if they have no curiosity. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said to the friend, and meant it in the sense that he was technically sorry for the social disruption, while also not being remotely capable of not doing this. He looked back at Juniper. I wanted to say, the Q3 reconciliation you sent, the way you handled the Meridian sub-accounts. She blinked, a small crack in the composure. You read the detailed reconciliation? I read everything, he said, which was true and which he suspected she already knew. It was exceptional work. I should have said so at the time. The crack widened slightly, and he saw something in it. Surprise, and underneath the surprise, something that might have been a kind of hunger. The hunger of someone who was very good at something and had long ago stopped expecting the fact to be noticed. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than he thought. She intended, Isnaid. Enjoy your evening, Miss Hale. He glanced at the friend. Both of you. He went back to his table. He sat down. Briggs had gone. The other men had gone. Declan was watching, carefully designed to convey that Declan had noticed nothing at all, which was Declan's way of conveying that he had noticed everything and would be asking questions at a more appropriate time. Caspian ordered a second glass of scotch. He did not look at Juniper's table again. Caspian, he thought about the Q3 reconciliation instead. It was, genuinely, exceptional work. She had flagged a discrepancy in the Meridian accounts that 3 other accountants had missed, and that, left unflagged, would have created a paperwork problem during a period when the organization could not afford paperwork problems. She had flagged it, resolved it, and documented the resolution in a footnote so unassuming that he'd nearly missed it himself. She had been doing things like that for 3 years. Quietly, unfailingly. Without asking for recognition or leverage or any of the things that most people eventually asked for when they were holding the kind of information she held. He had, he realized, been taking that for granted. He wasn't sure when exactly he had started thinking about it in those terms. He was fairly sure it was around the time she walked past his partition in a burgundy dress and laughed at something with her whole face. He finished the scotch. He left Duval's. He told Declan he was heading back to the office, and Declan, who had been with him long enough not to question logistical decisions made in a specific tone of voice, made no comment. In the car, Caspian looked out the window at the city going by and applied, for the second time that evening, the protocol. Identify. He had been standing too close to something for 3 years without knowing it was there. Assess. It was there. Resolve. Unclear. This was, for a man whose professional competence rested substantially on the absence of unclear, an unsatisfying place to land. The Thursday morning report came in at 7:42 a.m., as it always did. Caspian read it at his desk with his first coffee of the day. It covered the overnight cash movement on the warehouse accounts, the status of the Eastport arrangement following last night's dinner, and a flagged anomaly in the logistics sub-ledger that Juniper had identified and was recommending they review before the end of the week. She had written the flag the same way she wrote everything. Plainly, precisely, with exactly the information required and nothing superfluous. He read the flag twice. Then he picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Tells Miss Hale I'd like to meet at 9, he said. "My office." There was a brief pause that he recognized as his assistant calibrating the request against the patterns of the last 3 years, during which Caspian had met with Juniper exactly twice, both times in conference rooms, both times with at least 4 other people present. "Of course," his assistant said. Juniper arrived at 9 o'clock and 14 seconds. He noticed the 14 seconds because he noticed things, and also because he was starting to accept, paying an unreasonable amount of attention to anything connected to Juniper Hale. She was wearing a grey cardigan and dark slacks, and her hair was back in its usual low arrangement. She looked, in every visible respect, exactly like the woman who had spent 3 years making herself minimally noticeable in the background of a criminal organization. She sat down across from him and put her laptop on the edge of his desk and opened to the logistics file without being asked. The flagged amount moved through 3 shell accounts between Sunday and Tuesday, she said. The routing pattern is consistent with the Devereaux family's methodology. I have a comparison here if you want to see it. She turned the screen toward him. Someone is skimming. Small amounts, irregular intervals, designed to fall below the standard audit threshold. It wouldn't have come up in the quarterly without the cross-reference. Caspian looked at the comparison. Then he looked at her. How long have you known? He said. I suspected for about 6 weeks, she said. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. 6 weeks. I didn't want to accuse anyone incorrectly, she said, with a steadiness that he found, given the circumstances, genuinely remarkable. The people on this routing path they're not people I wanted to implicate without Evertson. He understood what she words were dangerous saying. The people on the routing path were dangerous people. She had sat on evidence against dangerous people for 6 weeks to make sure she was right before she said anything, and she had sat on it calmly, continued coming to work calmly, continued sending him reports on time with all the footnotes in order, and had said nothing. You should have told me sooner, he said. I'm telling you now, she said, which was not an apology. He looked at her for a moment. She met his gaze with the equanimity of someone who had spent years not flinching, and he found himself wanting to know everything there was to know about how she had gotten that way. Who else knows about this? No one. You're sure? I'm the only person in this organization who would have caught it, she said, without arrogance. Just fact. The cross-reference requires access to 3 separate accounts and knowing what you're looking at in all 3. I'm the only person here with that access and that context. She was right. He knew she was right because he had signed off on the access structure himself. I want you to document everything, he said. Time-cemented. All the source files, the comparison model, your methodology. Send it to no one but me. I'll have it by end of day. He nodded. She started to close her laptop. Miss Hale. She looked up. He had not decided before this moment what he was going to say. He found that unusual. He generally decided things before he said them. Last night, he said, what you said about not frequenting Duval's. I want to correct that impression. I go more often than I indicated. She was still for a moment. Something moved in her expression. Careful. Assessing. The look of a woman who was very good at recognizing when a situation had shifted and was deciding what to do about it. That's good to know, she said, and her voice had gone to neutral, which he was beginning to read as a defense. There's a table in the back, he said. Better than the partition, Quita. The pause that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was, Caspian had learned over 20 years of negotiations, exactly the amount of time a person needed to understand that an offer was being made and decide whether they wanted to take it. The Q3 flag was a particularly good catch, he said, because she was still deciding. And he had learned when to give a person the additional information they needed to make a decision. The Meridian accounts, she said. Yes, you mentioned that last night. I meant it both times. She looked at him. He looked back. Somewhere in the building below them, the Sever Group's legitimate business hummed along, in the way it hummed along every day. 12 floors of people moving money that had come from places that didn't bear close examination toward places that would serve Caspian's interests. And all of it organized and documented, and made coherent by the woman sitting across his desk in a grey cardigan who had just told him that someone in his organization was stealing from him and had known it for 6 weeks and had waited to be certain before she said a word. All right, Juniper said. He didn't ask her to clarify what she was agreeing to. She had accepted it. The specifics would clarify themselves. The end of day on the documentation, he said. End of day, she confirmed, and stood up and took her laptop and walked to the door of his office with the unhurried, particular composure of someone who was putting one foot in front of the other very carefully. At the door, she stopped. "Mr. Vore," she said, without turning around. "Yes. I wasn't sure you'd catch it." "I caught it," he said. She nodded, just once, at the door, and then she left. Caspian sat back in his chair. He thought about the 6 weeks she had held that information. He thought about the years she had spent making herself smaller than she was, in offices and conference rooms and corridors, and the woman who had laughed with her whole face at Duval's, and the woman who had just told him, without apology, that she had been the only person in his organization capable of protecting him from a threat he hadn't even known about. He picked up his phone. He called Declan. "The Devereaux routing issue," he said. "I'll brief you this afternoon. We'll need to move on it by the end of the week." "Understood," Declan said. "And clear my schedule Friday evening." There was a very brief pause. "From what time?" "7 onward," he said. "And find out if Duval's takes reservations for the back table." He ended the call. He looked out the window at the same city going by in the same October light. But the coordinates had shifted, the way they shifted when a piece of information changed the map. And Caspian Vore had always known that the most significant intelligence was rarely the kind you found where you expected to look for it. Sometimes it was in a footnote. Sometimes it had been sitting across a conference table from you for 3 years in a grey goo cardigan, waiting for the moment when you finally actually looked. He pulled up the Thursday morning report and read it a 3rd time with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. Then he got to work.